Welcome back to A Story to Tell from the campus of Dixie State University. Today we're speaking with Julia Creet. Have I pronounced that correctly?
Absolutely.
Julia, how are you?
I'm delighted to be here.
Where are you from?
I'm from Toronto, Canada.
Toronto. I've heard of that.
That's good.
I even spent some time there once, my misspent youth.
Yeah, it's a great city. Yeah, you should come back and visit. It's an entirely different city now. Huge.
Tell me about yourself, who you are, where you came from, and what you're doing.
Well, I'm actually an English professor at York University, which is in the north part of Toronto. Huge university, 50,000 students. And I've been an English prof there for almost 20 years. And a kind of accidental documentarian on the side.
Nothing is accidental.
True.
So tell me how it was an accident.
Well, the first documentary I made, the day before I left, and the first documentary was really what led me to make the second one. So the first one was a family history story, and the day I went on my roots trip, I thought I really should grab a camera. I'd never really used a camera before, but I thought I really should take a video camera. So I rented a very cheap VHS camera, and I took that with me and I started shooting. And then as the story developed, I got better and better cameras, and then I got people to shoot for me. And then I thought, oh yeah, I like the idea of doing a documentary, and then I was hooked. You
were hooked?
Yeah.
So what was the first documentary about?
So the first documentary was actually a story about my mother. And it's a quite common story. She was a Holocaust survivor who decided after the war that she just wanted to forget. She didn't want to be Jewish anymore. She didn't want to tell us what had happened to her. She really thought her path to survival was to do her best to forget about it. So we had no idea what had happened to her or what had happened to her family. And then after she died, I started to piece things together, and I thought, I need to know this story. She was Hungarian, so I spent a lot of time in Hungary. And eventually, in fact, did piece the story together. And towards the end of that process, I looked around and I thought, everybody's doing this. This isn't just me and my story. This is clearly now I'm part of a zeitgeist. And
what does that word mean? I read it here. What is that zeitgeist?
Zeitgeist is it's something that's happening all around you.
Okay.
You're part of a time. You're part of a
the here and now?
The here and now, absolutely. It's not just your personal motivation that makes you do something, but motivations that you might not really be all that aware of. We talk about the political zeitgeist, and those are the...
Well, let's not talk about that.
All right, let's not.
No, I'm kidding.
But in that sense,
right, yeah.
you understand what it means. So you can use that term for sort of cultural movements as well. So I then thought, okay, so if everyone's doing this, what's motivating other people, and why did I think my story was so special, and is there a bigger story here?
What did you find out about your mother that you didn't know?
Oh, so much that I didn't know. I mean, I found out who she lost and how she lost them, what her life was like growing up. I found people she'd gone to school with. I found people who had been students of my grandfather. I got a much clearer sense of who she had been and how that influenced why she decided to forget, because that was my very big question. Why did she decide that was her path to rebuilding her life? So I think I managed to answer that question for myself. And it gave me some insight into the kinds of difficulties that we had with her as a mother and her emotional state and why certain things set her off.
How many siblings were there?
I have 3 siblings.
Okay.
Yeah. And not all of them were excited about having that story told.
Some people don't want to know.
No, they don't want to know. And my older brother in particular felt that she had done everything in her power to protect us, and that we should have just left the story alone. And so that also brought me to this question of privacy with respect to genealogical information. So those two things, that the question of family secrets, privacy, and then this industry that had built up around it, that's what drove my curiosity about the next documentary, the one that I'm screening here at Doc Utah.
And what's the name of that?
This one is called Data Mining the Deceased. Ancestry.
Well, that's a clever title.
Yeah, Ancestry and the Business of Family. And that's really what it is now. It's a data mining operation.
Is it very profitable?
Oh, it's hugely profitable, yeah. The guys who started Ancestry.com, that was Paul Allen and Dan Taggart, who I interviewed for the documentary. They were very, very gracious, I have to say. By the time I interviewed them, they no longer owned it, but they had been bought out for $1.6 billion. Oh yeah, it's big business. And the bigger business, and this is the story that I really want to get out, is that the front end of the industry is about genealogy, and the back end is about selling the information to the pharmaceutical industry. Yeah, it's all of the genealogical companies that are offering DNA testing. What's so valuable about the information that they're gathering is that they're gathering the genealogical records and they're gathering the DNA. And when you braid those two data sets together, you get a very, very valuable data bank, really, a biobank that for the medical community and pharmaceutical community represents a way of understanding the inherited path of diseases. Now, on the one hand, that's a wonderful thing, that's a great thing. But people who are giving their information to genealogical sites, and particularly their DNA, don't realize that that's where the information is being sold to, because the genealogical companies take complete proprietary rights over that information.
How did they do that?
Well, it's in the terms of agreement.
In terms of the contract to have your DNA analyzed?
Yep. And when you give any information, any of your records to a genealogy company as well, they take complete proprietary rights. So that means that they can, they can do whatever they want with the information. They can sell it on, they can do research with it, they can do there's no limits to what they can do with the information.
Well, how do they tie that to disease? Is there disease information attached to the DNA or the files?
Well, certain companies, and the best example of this is actually a company in Iceland called Decode Genetics. And they were the ones who really started this phenomenon of using genealogical information for medical research. So they financed the collection of genealogical records of the entire country. And Iceland is a special case because it's a small country. It was isolated for thousands of years, really. Well, 1,000 years almost. And thousands is an exaggeration.
That's okay. We all exaggerate.
And so they're very genetically homogeneous. So that was then they asked for donated DNA samples, and then they got a license from the government of Iceland to have access to the medical records. And they braided those 3 data sets, and then they could track the genetic path of diseases. But people began to realize that there were huge privacy issues with having all of that information in the hands of one company. And then Decode went bankrupt, and they sold the entire data set to Amgen, which is an American pharmaceutical company. And now it's been sold on again, I think, to Parma Pharmaceutics. Or I can't, actually I don't remember who it got sold on to. So once that data is aggregated, the value in these companies is having it sold on. And they think that they can trace, and in fact you can trace the inheritance of certain diseases that have genetic markers. They haven't had much success yet coming up with drugs, as drugs that they've managed to bring to market on that research as a result of that research. So the promise of that kind of genealogical tracing hasn't really manifested yet. So that was the most Iceland is the most obvious example, but a company like 23andMe, which is a subsidiary really of Google, they collect.
I thought Google owned everything.
Well, they do. But now Google's going to own your bioinformation as well. So essentially what I'm saying trying to say to people who are interested in having their DNA done for genealogical reasons is think about where that information is going. You are giving those companies way more valuable information than they're giving you. And do you really want your DNA to be packaged and resold?
Well, that's a good question. I have a nephew who was adopted. My oldest brother adopted him. And for years and years and years, he never knew who his family was, his real family. And about 3 or 4 or 5 months ago, they submitted their DNA to, I guess it was Ancestry.com or whoever it was. And they matched them up with 3 or 4 potential relatives. And it turns out that they finally discovered who his mother was, and he's now had a reunion with his half-brothers and half-sisters in Reno, Nevada. Yeah. So there are some good things about it, I would guess.
No question. Yeah, I think for adoptees in particular, it's been invaluable. But there's a difference, I think, between the situation of adoptees where DNA can really help you break through particular kinds of silences, and people who engage in what's called recreational genomics. And
explain that to me.
Well, we think of genomics as genetic science as a kind of serious occupation, right? And it's a serious scientific endeavor. But DNA testing for ancestry is what they call recreational, a recreational use of genetics or genomics. And consumers are sold the idea, and this is particularly true of the genetic genealogy companies, that we don't know who we are unless we have that kind of testing done. We don't know, what percentage is European, what percentage is Asian, what percentage is what percentage is that. I
see the ads on TV, the guy's dancing in a Scottish kilt, and it turns out he's really French or something.
Right. So which is the more useful story? If this is all about, if genealogy is all about telling stories to ourselves about who we are, I mean, here you are, you know who you are, right? Do you need anybody
I wish I knew who I was.
Really? Are you confused?
Well, I had an identical twin brother, and we never knew which one of us was which and what wasn't which. Which one is which? I'm kidding about that.
Yeah. But the whole industry is it promotes itself with the idea that we lack some kind of knowledge about ourselves, and that only if we look at our records or we do our DNA can we really understand who we are. Well, that's, if the early 20th century, if the zeitgeist of the early 20th century was psychology, you can't know who you are without some form of psychology or analysis, or, the early 21st century is DNA. That's that we can't know who we are without that being sampled in some way. Digging, we're always finding ways of digging into ourselves.
The LDS Church has a big database.
Biggest in the world.
Do they get involved in DNA?
That was interesting. The LDS Church isn't collecting DNA, but there have been medical projects that were coordinated with LDS records. I think it was a company called Myriad Genetics, and I may or may not have that name right. And they started using the LDS records in the 1990s, and they were also collecting DNA samples from Mormon families, because Mormon families, again, are really kind of special cases because they're so genetically, once again, genetically homogeneous. So these are, again, very valuable data sets. So that company used the Mormon records and Mormon families, and then they tried to, and they were the first to find the BRCA2 breast cancer gene. And then they tried to patent the gene.
Who tried to patent it?
The Mira Genetics. So
I shouldn't laugh, I guess, but I guess anything's possible in the mind of an entrepreneur.
well, exactly. And so I think, again, that people don't realize that their DNA is actually being collected for entrepreneurial purposes, for commodification. But the Mormon database is an extraordinary database. I don't know how much you know about it. I can go on for a very long time.
Well, tell me about it.
So it's hard to know where to start. They started collecting records in 1894.
That was a little bit before I was born. But.
And they started collecting records because by that point the doctrine had developed to the point where they had started doing posthumous baptisms. This was they started doing them in the 1860s. They needed to keep a record of, first of all, they needed to find family, and then they needed to keep a record of who had been baptized, so that they didn't duplicate the baptisms. So the entire record-keeping project of the Mormon Church began with those two databases. It's called. They were file cards. They started off on with
microfilm.
Then microfilm. Yep. First they had a fleet of typists typing.
Punch cards.
Yep.
What do they call it? Anyway.
Well, they started actually with file cards, like library file cards.
Right.
And then they went to, microfilm was the next. In 1938, they started microfilming. They were one of the early adopters of microfilm technology. They've been early adopters of every kind of data storage technology there is. They now have 33 times the number of records as the Library of Congress.
Well, they used to have all these records in a cave somewhere.
Oh, they still got them.
Well, now they could put those records on one small flash drive, couldn't they?
Well, not really, because they've got petabytes of information,
Right.
thousands of petabytes of information.
Yeah.
So they hold the records in the Granite Mountain Vault. It's just outside.
Have you been there?
No, they don't let anybody in the vault anymore. Yeah.
No.
But they made when they closed the vault to the public, they made a video, their own video of it, because so many people wanted to go into the vault. And so they were very generous with me. I interviewed the CEO and the VP marketing and the VP at technology of Family Search, which is the Mormon database. And they also gave me access to the footage that they had shot inside the vault instead of letting me in. Oh yeah, no, they were incredibly helpful, I have to say. But their project is really, it's an extraordinary project because they want to collect all of the genealogical records in the world. The only problem with it is that it's all in the service of posthumous baptism. And there are other...
Well, and other ordinances they have.
And other ordinances, yeah right, sealings and other ordinances. And, there are, I think, people, again, who don't realize that that's where the information is going. And other faith groups who don't feel very comfortable with that.
Well, I read something on the internet or something about some Indian guru son, or they were complaining about somebody had posthumously baptized. Who would the Indian guru be that, anyway? And his son came out and said, well, I don't have any problem with it. If they want to baptize him, it's okay with me.
Well, some people hedge their bets and
Right.
say, great.
What harm can it do?
What harm can
Other
it
than
do?
somebody wanted to make an issue out of it.
Well,
No, I'm not advocating that, but I'm a believer in peace and tranquility and love your neighbor type thing, and not because she's lonely, but because you ought to be kind to. Anyway, I'm getting off the subject, but you know what I'm talking about.
Right. What harm can it do? And we're really talking about a kind of fantasy.
Right.
So what harm can it do? And the LDS Church doctrinally says, look, anyone we baptize posthumously will have a chance to refuse that.
Right.
The choice is theirs.
Right.
So there are layers and layers to
Gandhi was the...
Gandhi. They baptized, well, but they also baptized Hitler, they baptized Anne Frank, it's Mussolini, they're giving everyone a second chance at the second coming. They baptized Jesus, they have done some of them like high profile figures, some of them like to be able to say, I baptized so and so and so and so. But on a more serious note, it's, if you believe, if you have a particular, a strong faith, if you're Catholic or you're Jewish or you're Baptist, and you think, no, I want to be able to choose my version of what happens to me after death, and I don't want another faith group performing religious rites for me on my behalf. And I think you have to accept that other religious groups have as strong feelings that are as strong as the Mormon faith.
Now, I don't know everything about Mormonism, but it's my understanding that they don't just routinely do those ordinances for the dead unless they have permission from somebody to do it. Am I wrong there?
Yeah, afraid so. Yeah. No, that's why they're collecting the database. And they work in collaboration with Ancestry, because Ancestry.com, so Ancestry was started by Mormon entrepreneurs, and there's still a very close relationship between Ancestry and the church. And as Shipley Munson, the VP marketing of Family Search, the LDS database, said to me, we're trying to create a community. We want to get as many people involved in this as possible. So the more people who use the database, the more people who come into the hobby, the more information they have. And it's the users who create the family units. It's one thing to have a record, but you have to have the family relationships, and it's a lot of the users who establish those relationships. All of that, once it's in the LDS database, they use that information just as the commercial databases do for their own purposes. So no, there are no limits. I mean, there was controversy with when they started baptizing Holocaust victims. That was a huge controversy that erupted in the 1990s, and at that point the church said, okay, we won't baptize any Jewish ancestors who weren't personally related to church members. But other than that, that's the only limitation that they've put on.
Interesting.
On their ordinances.
So what should we do when we see these commercials on TV about Ancestry.com?
Go have a look at the website and go beyond the front of the website. Go into the business pages of the website. See who they're reporting to. They now call themselves, Ancestry calls themselves a science and technology company. That's the way that they identify themselves to their investors. Well, they're private now, so they don't have investors, but that's the way they identify themselves to the companies to whom they're selling the information.
Well, do they have access to the LDS database?
Yes, they have access. The LDS gives them access to particular segments of the database that even the LDS doesn't make public, because the LDS is invested in the success of Ancestry. And so they, as Shipley Munson said to me—
How is that? Are they part owner in it?
That I wasn't able to find out, because it's now owned by a private equity firm in Europe called Perma Investments.
So Ancestry's
owned by a private investment company. So you can't really find out who the major shareholders— well, you can. The major shareholders are the executives of Ancestry, and then, you know, other than that, it's unknown who the shareholders are.
We've got 2.5 minutes left. Wrap up your story. And
so what I would encourage people to do, and you know, genealogy is one of the most popular hobbies in North America right now. According to the LDS Church, 1 in 4 Americans are registered in their database, have registered. I would really encourage genealogists to look at the terms of agreement in all of these databases, and to think twice, or at least to act in some kind of informed choice manner when you decide to give your DNA to a genetic genealogy company, because what you're giving them is much more valuable than what they're giving you.
well, how should they do it? Charge them a fee for it?
Or just not do it. Yeah, but just be aware of where
That's the situation.
Yeah.
That they're using that and selling it to other people.
Yep.
Well, that's rude of them.
Well, that's capitalism, isn't it?
Oh.
Shouldn't we just expect that? You know, they say that personal information is the new oil.
Huh.
I don't know who says
I
that.
tell everybody about everything I've ever done in my entire life, both of the things I've done. So I've given it away already.
Well, we give away tons of personal information.
Yeah.
But usually we have some sort of sense of what we're giving away and why. This is a very seemingly benign industry that has, I think, a back end that's maybe not quite so benign.
Well, it's nice of you to bring it to the front end.
Thank you.
What's the name of it again?
It's called Data Mining the Deceased. And it's on at 4:20 this afternoon, this being Thursday.
Well, you know, we're out of time, but there's a Holocaust victim talking somewhere tonight.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, over at the Abbey Inn, I think.
Huh.
Are you aware of that?
No, I didn't know that.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
We've got 42 seconds left.
I want to thank you for having me here.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. It's been very interesting. It's something I'd not even been aware of. And I thought I knew everything. Oh, it's my wife that knows everything. Don't tell her I said that.
I think you just put it on tape.
Oh, darn.
Yeah.
Thanks again for being with us.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for being with us on A Story to Tell. We've been speaking with Julia Creet on A Story to Tell from the campus of Dixie State University. This is Lane Rono. Thanks again for being with us.